Hi, I'm Nolan Dalla. I'm here with Matt Lessinger, and this is an intelligent conversation. This is our fourth intelligent conversation. The other three topics were we discussed, we talked about the impact of social media. We discussed the meaning of atheism. And last week we discussed American politics, the American political scene, and how the current political climate might make people leave the country. But today's topic might be even more controversial, and that topic that topic is music, more specifically modern music and pop music. And to be even more precise, my question to Matt is today's popular music not as good as previous generations? I was going to express the question in a more incendiary terms. Is modern music shit? But I opted to make this discussion a little more civil, also about today's music versus times in the past, such as the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and beyond. Let me explain to listeners what this show is not. I, I I and we do understand that there's many alternative forms of music, and there's a lot of great music out there: jazz, blues, classical, folk. I mean, I could go on and on with different genres of music that Matt and I both enjoy, and that I'm sure you enjoy. However, today's discussion is more about popular music, or what's called pop music, top of the charts type music. This is music that, again, the music that's the most popular in the country and really around the world. So that's our focus of discussion. So don't get mad at us because we didn't discuss jazz or blues or folk or anything else. Although we will touch on some of those things in this discussion. So let me tell you why Matt Lessinger, my colleague here, and for all intents and purposes, he's really my guest here, because I'll be asking him a lot of questions, and why he's uniquely qualified to address this topic and answer some of the questions I'm going to pose to him in this discussion and interview. Matt Lessinger, I've known for 20, 25 years, as you regular listeners know. He's really known for something that some of you may know about, and that's that he handicaps the Grammy Awards every year. Of course, the Grammys is the biggest awards thing in music, and Matt has just an uncanny ability not only to offer an opinion, but his opinions are just incredibly on. I could get into some of the projections he's made, picking long shots to win Album of the Year, New Artist of the Year, this and that. He just has a remarkable ability to see what's going to happen, and that to me is really that's quite a remarkable talent for anyone, but let alone somebody that, well, Matt is not a young guy. He's not the current generation. He's 45 years old. So this to me makes his accomplishments or expertise in this field even more noteworthy. I could give you a long list of his resume about why he's, again, uniquely qualified here. I'll give you just one. He was on National Public Radio as a guest talking about this very topic. So I'm just going to say that if he's good enough for National Public Radio, he's good enough to talk to Nolan Dalla on an intelligent conversation. So that's a long-winded introduction of Matt today. And Matt, before we get into some of the aspects of modern popular music, can you tell me why you're so into music, and maybe address, you being, especially your age, you being a little bit of an outlier. Most people in their 40s, let's face it, they're not in today's music scene, but you are. Why are you so different in this way?
Um, well, thank you for the introduction. That's, wow, the best introduction I've had since my wedding, maybe. I mean, that's great. Um, wow. So I guess it's been part of my family for as long as I can remember. And that's probably true for a lot of people's families. None of us were trained musically. So when we're talking about musical expertise, I just want to clarify, I never even learned an instrument. And that to me is like one of the saddest things. If there is literally one thing I could go back and change, I wish I had taken a greater interest in music,
Yeah,
learning music, learning
yeah,
how to, make music when I was younger. But having said that, I mean, it goes back to my grandfather, who used to play standards from the 30s and 40s. and he would play, you know, Ella Fitzgerald and Benny Goodman and Peggy Lee. And then my father was into doo-wop. I grew up in the Bronx, New York, and doo-wop was a huge part of the music scene for him. And he still waxes poetic about the groups that would just be standing on the street corners singing a cappella. I mean, to him, that was music. And he actually moderates a group on Facebook called the Doo-Wop Corner, which has almost 8,000 members right now. And it even, some of the members are even members of the old groups, of the old doo-wop groups, who are thankful that their music is being kept alive by him. And his focus is from 1948 to 1963, and he classifies the doo-wop era as like the continuation of group harmony, rhythm, and blues, I think would be the best summation of it. And they were based largely in New York and Philadelphia, but then also it turns out, you know, in California as well. And that's something he only discovered recently. Like, when, you know, talking about all the ills of social media, one of the great things about social media is how even in this decade, he's been able to rediscover music from 50, 60 years ago that he never doo-wop, and vice versa. And so now he's been exposed to music he never got to hear as a kid, and it's almost like experiencing the doo-wop era all over again, which, you know, nothing could make him happier. And then for myself, I mean, I grew up with 80s music. You know, I was a child of the 80s, but, you know, there was such a diverse offering of music in the 80s that, to me, you just can't classify it as 80s music. I mean, you'll have a radio station that plays quote unquote 80s music, but, you know, does that take into account the dance music and the heavy metal and the hard rock and the hair bands? And then, you know, going back to the early 80s, you know, the disco-ish sound. And then in the middle, you do have Michael Jackson and Madonna, who people associate the most with the 80s. But I'm just saying that usually radio does not capture the wide variety of music that is being offered. So we are going to talk about pop music. I understand that. I am definitely going to divert from that a little bit. I hope you're okay with that, just in the sense that focusing on the day, and I'll get into that, but you know, as you can see from the Grammys, which you followed, the most popular acts don't often translate to the best acts. So we'll keep that in mind as we have this discussion.
Okay, well said, Matt. Thank you for that background. And now let's get into some, let's get into some healthy debate here. I'm assuming the role, even though it's not, I'm not faking anything here. I'm going to be called the curmudgeon here. You know, that's the way I'm going to come across, and that's partially true, and you'll certainly see that by some of the questions I pose to you. But let me begin on exactly that note. I'm sitting here. In front of me is the Billboard Top 100 chart from October 1st, 1970. Now that's 50 years ago today. And let me read some of the singers and bands and songs off this chart. Number one this week, 50 years ago. Number one, Ain't No Mountain High Enough by Diana Ross.
Okay.
All right, we know that one. Number two, Looking Out My Back Door by Creedence Clearwater Revival. Number three, Neil Diamond. I could go on and on. The Jackson 5, The Carpenters, James Taylor, I've Seen Fire and I've Seen Rain. On and on. These are just the top 10. And it didn't matter if you were into rock or you were into Motown or whatever. We, black, white, Latino, young, old, male, female, we all knew these songs and these artists, and we all grew up with them. And there was a cross-pollination of interest. It wasn't as though, you know, things are very segmented today. Back then, I think everyone loved good music. Now, let's take a look at the most recent.
Oh, dear.
You know what's coming, but I'm on a roll here. I'm on a roll here.
Go ahead.
So
Yes,
this is the top 100 Billboard chart, exactly the same source, exactly the same source. Now we don't have October 1st, but I'm going to go to the most recent one, which is the week ending in September. And I'm going to ask, not necessarily you, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but I'll give you some time to catch up. Do some Google searching if you need to.
No, just go for it. Go ahead.
But this is for my listeners. This is for the listeners here on this one. And let me just say that, first of all, could anybody name number one if I wasn't to give it to you? All right, number one, WAP. That's not an Italian slur, by the way. It's W-A-P, WAP. And that's number one. That's Cardi B, which I know she is, of course. Dynamite by BTS is number two.
Do we know what that stands for, by the way?
I don't know. Dynamite or WAP? I don't know. Anyway, let me just roll on. Laugh Now. They're by the way, the track on, because I'm not going to read it from the Billboard chart. Laugh Now, Cry Later. That's by Drake. I've heard of Drake. Rockstar by Da Baby featuring Roddy Rico. Okay, got it. Blinding Lights by The Weeknd. That sounds like something maybe I could get into. Mood, 24K Golden featuring Ian Dior. 7, Watermelon Sugar by Harry Styles. That sounds like it's at least same. Savage Love, this is number 8. Josh 6. What are these online poker screen names? Josh 685. What the hell? Where do they come up with these names? 24 Golden and Josh 680. Where are these names coming from? They sound like online poker players. Before You Do by Louis, some Italian name, Capaldi, I think. All right, and then What's Poppin' by Jack Harlow, featuring DaBaby and Lil Wayne, who I've heard of. I couldn't pick him out of if he's walking by me. But anyway, so these are the top 10. Now, what I want to know is this. Do you think anybody over the age of, well, you're 45, but let's say 40, knows these artists, listens to these artists, has any sense of what's going on in the pop music scene today? Obviously, I'm asking a very rhetorical, leading, rude question to you. In 1970, I guarantee you, everybody knew who Neil Diamond was and who Michael Jackson was, or I should say the Jackson 5 was, or Diana Ross was. But does anybody know these people? What do you think? What do you think, Matt? Matt, are you there? Matt, are you there? Hello?
I'll then mortify you even further.
Okay, sorry. You there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, let's try it again. Go ahead. So anyway, I was asking you about these artists. Start your answer again, please.
Yes. So,
I'm here. Go ahead.
No problem. I was going to say, just to horrify you even further. Okay. Just to horrify you even further. WAP stands for Wet Ass Pussy. That's the number one song.
Oh, are you serious?
Right,
really?
So,
are you serious?
I am. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Okay. Now let me take a step back now. Okay. You're not comparing apples to apples. Okay.
I guess.
And let me briefly get into why.
Well, watermelons. I don't know.
Well, no, you're not. It's not even close to apples for a couple of reasons. All right. So number one is that there were just fewer radio stations back then, right? So just like there were fewer TV stations. So if you wanted your news, everybody got their news from Walter Cronkite or whatever, and everybody got their music from the same general station. So, fast forward 50 years, radio is not even the main issuer. It's not what people are listening.
Right.
It's not where people are getting their music from. Excuse me for tripping over myself. Okay. Much more so, people are going onto Pandora and YouTube and other, paid services that, cater to their likes. Because why would you want to sit and listen to a radio station that may or may not play a song that you like, when nowadays you can, go onto Pandora as an example, and almost certainly you're going to get music that is to your liking. So having said that, what are the songs that are topping the charts right now are the ones that are getting the most radio airplay, and the most radio stations are rap and hip hop stations, because the demographic for radio listeners is teenagers. I mean, a lot of us are not sitting around listening to Radio, unless it is, you know, at our age, unless it's a throwback station, unless it's, you know, all 80s all the time or classic rock or whatever, it's not the songs that are on the charts, right? So the songs that are on the charts are dominated by rap and hip hop because that's what kids are mostly listening to on the radio. And then it's what they're predominantly paying for. Hardly anybody pays for music the way we used to pay for albums back in the day. But if you're paying for a streaming service, it's most likely kids doing that because we've already got our music collection built up, right? So it's kids that are listening to new music coming out right now. So we have no influence. Our musical tastes have zero influence on today's charts, right? So it's not surprising that it's a totally different genre of music. Now, are you going to see WAP at the, you know, featured in the Grammy Awards? Like, I don't think so. You know, this is not going to be. It might. So I want to, you know, clarify. You know, maybe we have gone that far. That maybe it will show up. I mean, Cardi B was nominated last year, but you know, that's the long but simple answer, is that it's not the same music scene that it was back then. And you know, there's good and bad to that, right? Back when there was 5 TV stations, there was something comforting in the fact that we were all watching the same thing. But at the same time, there's something nice now about having 500 stations, and you can pick and choose what's most to your liking. And it's the same with the music scene. Like, we're just moving with the times is really all that is.
All right. Well, all right. Since I'll give you a story. You know, since 2012, as you know, I've written a daily blog, which addresses a variety of topics. Now, there's a point coming, so stay with me here. You know, I've written on politics, sports, food, wine, history, you know, sports picks. And about 5 years ago, I wrote a story, and I wrote it really in about 30 minutes. I really gave very little thought to it. It was just more of a rant. And I basically said, this is the title. And the title was, if you're under the age of 25, your music fucking sucks. Of course, I had to stick the word fucking in there because it wasn't insulting enough. I had to write, you know, I had to belt him across the face twice by completely insulting him. And the reason I bring up this article that I wrote 5 years ago, I posted it, you know, didn't really pay attention. Next morning, I mean, the inbox is like full. And I have written about 2,200 by my last count articles in the last 8 years, 2,200.
Mm-hmm.
That article's number 3 in the rankings as far as like number of hits, about 300,000 hits.
Mm.
I have had 800 comments on that. I've had death threats. I've had people say, you wouldn't believe, you should go to the comment section and read. It's wildly entertaining, by the way. And I'm called every name in the book, and they all start with the F or MF. You know, our C, you know, I could go on and on.
Yeah.
And here's my takeaway from that. By the way, I find this wildly entertaining because I wrote this. It was just a passionate piece about, look at all this shitty music. And it was basically addressing like the electronic dance music. That to me is just fucking garbage. Okay.
Wow.
Listen, I
Okay.
can get into some of this other stuff. I certainly see why rap is popular. There's a certain urban angst to the messaging. It expresses frustrations and a lot of things that are just part of the culture. Now, and I've had people argue with me on, say, electronic dance music, which I really pick on here. The Electric Daisy Carnival Festival, which is here in Las Vegas, is a huge thing, and people come in for that. And they have tried to tell me, you know, why it's such a great, virtuous, you know, wonderful cultural event, and maybe it is in some ways. But the reason I bring these stories or scenarios up is because I couldn't believe how passionate people are about their music. And you know, you can burn down the planet with global warming, or you rip up the Constitution, and people aren't as upset as when you offend them about their music. I mean, it's truly remarkable. And by the way, if you think this is just like with young people, go and bash country music and see what kind of reaction you get on that.
Right.
Bash classic rock. See what kind of feedback you get from that. Bash, you know, you could go on and on. But people are passionate about their music. to a level that, by the way, I was shocked about. Again, you could rip up their Constitution, you can poison their air and piss in their water, and they don't care nearly as much as when you call their favorite singer, untalented or something. Please, Matt,
Yes.
explain that to me.
Well, I could tell you that I feel the same way. When you just now were talking about, what you wrote about today's music in general sucks. I wasn't at all offended. I wasn't surprised one bit. Then you went after specifically EDM, electronic dance music, and I felt myself tense up. I was like, oh, no, we didn't. So
you're not gonna pull the plug and run off the interview, are you?
I'm not, but I mean, you might have to endure me defending EDM. So
go for it.
okay, well, I mean, look, let's start from a more basic sense, but then I am going to defend it. But let's take a step back. Let's agree that new music is harder and harder to make the more time that goes by, right? No matter what the genre is, right? So you named all those acts from 50 years ago, which I will grant you are all iconic acts. I will also argue that they were in the infancy of their style of music. So to try to get somebody to do what they did 50 years later is tremendously harder. And I'm not even just talking about from an originality standpoint, such that it's something that you and I are going to want to listen to. It's an originality standpoint where they have to worry about lawsuits, where it's like, I can't copy anything anybody has done before me without paying them off, or else I have to worry about. And that goes back to even the era you were talking about. You remember My Sweet Lord by George Harrison?
Sure.
You remember how he was in a lawsuit over it, how it copied He's So Fine?
He's So Fine. Yeah, right.
Exactly. So, and that was in the 70s, right? He couldn't come up with something original then. I mean, obviously George Harrison had plenty of original music, but you get the point that I'm making, that like, you can't trip over now 50 years later, you can't trip over any music that's been done since then or run the risk of a lawsuit. So I give credit to any artist who comes up with something original nowadays. Now, going back to what you said about—
By the way, real quick, Matt, that's a really good counter argument. I'm going to give you a +1 on that. I had not thought about that, how difficult it is to be original in today's world and then add those legal complications and this and that. Very good point. I'll give you a +1 on that, but please continue.
Thank you. And so it's understandable that, you're calling yourself a curmudgeon. I mean, ask any, any middle-aged person, that has to hear, quote unquote, today's music, and they're going to say, oh, my music was better. And then people, in their 70s and 80s are going to think their music was the best that they grew up with. And there's, multiple reasons for that. I mean, here, I'll name 3 reasons for that. One is that typically we have the least amount of responsibilities in our teenage years. So we have the most time to listen to music and absorb music and really appreciate it and listen to a wider variety of music. And and plus we're taking things in more when we're in our teenage years. So we're always going to have fonder memories of the music we heard then. Number 2, music is most often associated with a time in our lives or a particular event. And the older we get, the less noteworthy events we have in our lives. And sorry if that's depressing, it's just a fact.
Tell me about it.
Right. I mean, growing up, you can have like all these markers in your childhood, on your path to adulthood, times in college, times in high school, your first kiss, your first sex, your first anything. And you've got the music that you have in your mind with those occasions. And that's always going to be with you. And the music that is your marker when you're 45, in my case, just doesn't carry the same weight. And that's going to be true for anybody. So it's understandable that the music you grew up with is going to hold a dearer place in your heart. And then number 3 is just going back to what I said before. It's harder to create original music as time goes by. So there's legitimate reasons why the music 30 years ago was quote unquote better than the music is today. And I'm not arguing that. Like, I will freely admit that music from the 1970 charts is way better than the music from the 2020 charts. That's not up for debate, right? What's up for debate is how well are the people in 2020 doing with what they have to work with, right?
Oh.
So now, again, looking at how like rap and hip hop dominate the charts, and I know some people put those two together. I still tend to separate those two categories, but because I think hip hop is a little too all inclusive, but whatever the case.
I'm sorry. You have to just do something for me. I don't want to lose this point. Explain that very briefly. Explain why you think they should be separate. I don't think a lot of our audience, and certainly me, doesn't quite get that.
Sure. I think hip hop was a term that came to make that was brought about to make rap more accepted mainstream, but then rap has become more of an hip hop rather has become more of an umbrella of like any spoken word, upbeat, African American stereotypical music has landed in the hip hop category because rap just carried too many negative connotations for the music industry. So they didn't want to go with that. But a lot of the, artists today, such as, Chance the Rapper, or Kendrick Lamar, or who did we just say, Cardi B. I mean, they're rappers. Like, to call them hip hop artists is too general. So I guess that's what I'm saying. It's like rap and then other quote unquote hip hop artists. That was probably not the best explanation, but
no, I know it gives me a better view. And by the way, there's a really interesting, I mean, this would be a whole other show, but about the marketing this sound to maybe middle mainstream audiences. That's where the money is, right? I mean, there's certainly a lot of money in urban culture, of course, and that's another word for black culture largely. But if you're going to appeal to white high school kids, rap may be a little too in your face maybe, and so I could see changing the labeling on that. That's a very I kind of whitewashed the description there. Is that kind of the way you're talking about?
No, that's completely accurate though. I mean, if you look back, and NWA has rediscovered, has been rediscovered by this generation. But when NWA came out, they were way too hardcore for you. You didn't hear them on the radio. Maybe in LA you heard them, but you did not hear them on the East Coast. You did not hear them even on the stations that were playing rap in New York. That's all I could speak to because I grew up in New York. So, I mean, and I knew of NWA. I knew who they were, but they did not carry the weight that they do today as like the pioneers of the industry because they were just too much for the industry at that time. Okay,
Matt, let me give you one more thing because you just say so many interesting things that just elicit more. I want to know more. Talk about the rap scene, particularly. They used to say the LA scene and the New York scene really didn't even know what each other were doing for so many years. I don't understand how that's possible. Can you explain that?
Well, sure. Well, all right. So I'm going to give you a more generic answer for that. And the generic answer goes all the way back, from the beginning of radio to about 2005, which is that, music was very territorial. And rap was especially territorial, but that's always been the case. Like what I said with my father's doo-wop music, where there was New York doo-wop and Philadelphia doo-wop and California doo-wop, and they rarely mixed. The only song he can remember that he ever knew that came out of California was Earth Angel, right, by the Penguins, which was such a big hit that they couldn't hold it back, if that makes sense. Like it was too big to be kept on one coast. But other than that, just about every other doo-wop song made in California stayed in California, during that time, as far as radio airplay went. Same thing with rap. That was sort of a manufactured battle, if you want to say, like East Coast versus West Coast. Like there was never really any battle. Tupac and Biggie Smalls tried to play off of that and make it, to promote mostly, but there was never any animosity. I mean, I shouldn't say never any. That's obviously a huge generalization. There was some animosity.
Yeah, especially when one of them was shot. But
no.
I shouldn't laugh, but that's
No, but if you asked them privately, they had respect for each other. You know what I mean? It wasn't like, so it was more a promotional thing than anything else. to have the East Coast rappers and the West Coast rappers. And
Right.
so, you know, going back to the 80s, for example, I mean, there was some rap that was more cultural, more, you know, talking about the problems of the day. And that's, you know, what most people would refer to as like old school rap. Then you had the stuff that was more suited for radio airplay, like Young MC and MC Hammer, and, you know, You Can't Touch This, and Bust a Move by Young MC, and DJ Jazzy Jeff, and the, you know, and the Fresh Prince, and you know, things like that, where you know, there was just two different categories. What could we market to people over the radio, and what can't we? That was in the 80s. Then came the 90s, and it was like, okay, you can't hold it back anymore. Like the rap that is socially relevant is going to be heard. And that, to me, largely started with Nas, who you may or may not have heard of, who came out with his debut album in 1994, and that really, to anybody who was following the rap scene, was revolutionary. Like, that was, there's no holding it back anymore. Like, everybody's going to be hearing this music. The 90s were a really strange conglomerate for rap. I'll just go into it briefly, because you had Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, you know, had just come out then. And that was sort of radio friendly, but not really. I mean, it had tons of profanity, but it appealed to, like you said, the white people who wanted to associate with Black culture without getting too deep. You know, it was like, it was subscribing to all of the stereotypes of gang violence and drug use and things like that, that, you know, without getting too deep, it was like, it was portraying African Americans in a negative light, and therefore had more appeal to a white audience, you know? And then you had Nas, and then you had Eminem, who also opened a whole bunch of doors because he was white. Let's not leave his whiteness out of it. You can't. I mean, he would never have gotten the opportunity, and he would never have become as big as he was if he wasn't white. Having said that, he has still put out a remarkable body of music. And the fact that he's still going, like, the shelf life for rappers, you know, is at best 4 or 5 years. He's had a career that's reaching 25 years now. So what he's managed to do is incredible. And he, you know, opened a lot more doors where people were willing to give rap music a listen that weren't listening to it before. Now, here's the problem when you're talking about today's music. These pioneers did such a great job of making the relevant music for their time that it's hard to come up with so much original stuff, because for all of the interesting aspects of rap, it's a pretty limited genre. Like, you can sample other music, but for the most part, it's spoken word talking about the problems of the day. Or if you're not talking about the problems of the day, if it's more lighthearted, you're talking about women or drug use, or, you know, or your boys, or whatever else, you know, whatever people can resonate with. But trying to come up with something now, 20 to 30 years after those acts have come along, and you've got to come up with your own set of lyrics, your own set of, you know, rhyming patterns that have all been largely done to death. You know, there's only so many words that rhyme with so many words, right? I mean, it's just that's the case. Like, it's hard to come up with something original. And then on top of that, to put a sound on it that's appealing to people's sensitivities. So it's like a doubly hard task, because the lyrics need to be strong, much stronger than pop music. Pop music, with all due respect, you can put any lyrics on it. As long as it's got a good sound, people are going to listen to it, right? Rap music, you can't come weak with the lyrics. Like, you have to say something that people are going to listen to and they want to hear. And then on top of that, it has to have a hook that people are going to want to listen to. So that's why I give more respect to people who are able to make it in that field now, because it is that much harder. And it's not a surprise that people are becoming more and more sensationalistic, like Cardi B, you know, trying to push the envelope even farther, in terms of what can we sing about or rap about, because so much of it has already been done. So how are you going to stay original? How are you going to stay relevant? You got to keep pushing the envelope. And too often when we push the envelope, we're reaching things that become distasteful, or especially to an older generation, or, things that just are not as aesthetically pleasing.
Well, let me jump in on that, if I may,
Sure.
Matt, because that's kind of what's going to be my next question. But I don't want to lose this because you're just right on the right on this. So I remember, say in the '60s, when rock musicians had long hair and they were, dropping certainly hints of sexuality, although it wasn't nearly as overt as just dropping f-bombs into songs now, and
Mhm.
particularly a lot of incendiary, lyrics now towards violence and so forth. But I'm not making a political statement here. It's just, this is fact.
Mhm.
This is the way today's music is. Largely, a lot of urban music is. And here's what I wonder. I'm not asking you to take a moral, ethical position on that. I'm rather asking you to play the role of social scientist here and futurist, and try to predict what will, where do we go from here? I remember people saying, years ago, like, how does it, how can you grow your hair any longer? You can't. How can you turn the amp up to 10? Well, you can turn it to 11, and your eardrums
Right.
get blown out. I mean, you
Right.
can only go so far. And
Right.
so, like, every single norm, and again, this is not a moral or ethical. I'm not being a church lady here. Like, I'm
Mhm.
upset with, I drop a lot of f-bombs, as people know. But I just wonder how much, how many boundaries can you push now? They've all been pushed. Hell, they haven't been pushed. They've been run over and flattened and thrown into a dumpster.
Right.
So I wonder, where does it go from here? Is it just now we just keep repeating kind of where we are, and we stay in this perpetual motion of where we are? It certainly, you can't grow your hair longer. You can't drop any more f-bombs than we do now, or can
Right.
we? What do you think about the future,
Well, what a great lead into electronic dance music, because that's the
Matt?
future.
Okay.
Okay. Because there's only so many chords you can play on a guitar, right? There's only so many keys on a piano. The potential of electronic music is infinite, without exaggeration, right? You can make any sound in any form possible. And that's why, to me, that's the future. Is the future of, now specifically talking about rap and hip hop, to drop any more F bombs or whatever? Nah, I mean, you're right. You can't go much further with that. So maybe to some degree that genre of music will run its course. Um, maybe I don't really have a crystal ball for that, but maybe urban music will pivot a little bit. I mean, you're focused on the F bombs and stuff, but if you listen to the lyrics of some of the more prominent hip hop rap artists today, and let's leave out the Cardi B song for now because that's going to completely go against my argument. But
You mean
some of
this?
the,
Sorry, you mean the song that's the #1 song in the world right now? But go ahead.
yes, that song, yes.
Other
So
other other
yeah.
than what happened, Mrs. Lincoln? How did you enjoy the play?
Well, look, to argue the other side, right? It, at least she has the freedom to do that.
I'm
You know
not
what I'm
knocking
saying?
that. No, of
Whether
course
it's
not.
not, it's not to my taste, it's not to your taste, but if she wants to sing to that degree about her sexuality, she's able to do that now, which certainly was not the case before. And
Yeah.
obviously it has an audience because, like you said, it's #1. Not just that song, but a lot of others have really well thought out socially relevant lyrics. And are we going to, people of our age, going to sit there and take the time to listen to them? No, but it's like our generation's poetry slams. You know what I mean? It's like, in a poetry slam, you stood up there and just spoke. Well, now these rappers are all the ones that I'm thinking of are trying to be socially relevant, right? They're trying to make statements, and that's what resonates with teenagers nowadays who are understandably fed up with, I mean, every generation's teenagers are fed up with something about the older generation. But now looking back at the 80s, what we were fed up with was child's play compared to what, people have to deal with nowadays, right? I mean, that it's not even close. If you're a teenager now and you got to look at the leadership in this country and wonder what the fuck is going on, you're going to look to music as one of the outlets
Yeah.
for people that understand the angst that you're going through. And in the 60s, like you said, with the long hair and everything, I mean, you could relate to that. Even if you can't relate to the music itself, you could relate to feeling like a teenager and looking to music as an outlet and as, somebody who thinks the same as you do and who's going to express in music the same views that you're expressing. That's just, I've seen fire and I've seen rain, right? It's just a little bit harsher now than that simple message, but
Yeah, I've
still
seen
makes
fucking
message.
fire and I've seen fucking rain, man.
Yeah, man, it has been raining like a motherfucker in here. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
right. Put a drum
Right,
beat on it. Yeah. All right, this is
right.
terrific, Matt. All right, so let me give our listeners a little bit of a break because I want to go to I call this the interruption moment because it's kind of like halftime here. We're talking
Okay.
about popular music, of course, and I'm Nolan Dalla talking to Matt Lessinger, our resident expert on modern music, which I'm certainly not. But I'm going to just deviate for a moment here and we were discussing this before the show and talking about what we call where you had to pull the car over and stop it and turn up the podcast or the radio if it was on the radio or whatever you were listening to. That's metaphorical, of course. Let me give you a little story, by the way, what that term refers to. Brian Wilson was of course, the creative genius behind the Beach Boys, and he told a remarkable story back in 1964. He was really he and the Beach Boys were top of the charts. Very popular, and Brian Wilson is I think I said Brian Jones there. I meant Brian Wilson, excuse me. But Brian Wilson was driving through, I think, Laurel Canyon around, Los Angeles, and the Ronettes song "Be My Little Baby" comes on. "Be
Hmm.
My Baby,"
Yep.
which is a Phil Spector produced wall of sound, very famous song. "Be My Little Baby." It is really a remarkable sound, very revolutionary. Again, wall of sound for the time. And so Brian Wilson's telling this story where he's in a convertible, and he said he had to hit the brakes and stop. And he said, "Whoa, what is that?" And he just cranks up the radio and sits there and listens to the other 2.5 minutes while it plays on the radio. And he was just sitting there in his and he of course tells the story better than I did, but he was just staring straight ahead saying, "Oh my God, what did I just hear?" And I think anybody who likes music, or I should say loves music, any kind of music, has a moment, one or two moments like that, where they remember, and maybe it was associated with a life moment. It could have been that. Or maybe it was just driving down the highway. Or maybe, late at night, you're at home. It could have just been, it's always spontaneous, by the way. It's never something that you plan out. It's never like, oh, I'm going to listen to a great song today. This is going to hit me. There's no such thing as that happening. It always happens generically. And I'm going to give you a couple of mine. And I know, Matt, you've shared some of yours, and I want you to share, but I'll give you a couple of
Sure.
moments that will shock people, because I think what this is going to tell you is the songs that sometimes we are just blown away by. Over time, they're not songs that stand the test of time, is the way I'll put it.
Mhm.
And what I mean is, like, I remember having to stop my car, and I said, "Holy shit, that's amazing." And I'm going to give you a couple of songs, and you're going to say, "Man, boy, you have bad taste in music," or "You're just, boy, what was wrong with you? Were you high?" Or there's going to be there will be listeners will be shocked by this, but I swear this is just my natural reaction. And by the way, I used to have one hell of an album collection. I listened to all the music, and I listened to a lot of hits, a lot of different kinds of music, I should say. So let me give you a couple that just are going to kind of shock you, and then Matt, I'd like you to take this.
Sure.
But this is an early '80s song. If you remember, Der Kommissar by Falco. When I heard Der Kommissar
Hmm.
by Falco, I was like, "Holy shit, that's amazing." We'll Be Together by Sting. Sting went solo around, I guess, the mid '80s. And then he cut. I think this is off his second or third album, but "We'll Be Together Tonight." That doesn't sound like how could you be like shocked at that But there was something about the electronic beat of that song that was just stunning to me. Also, this is going to be an older song that people will remember, or at least an older sound. I'll give you a story on this one. John Fogerty left Creedence Clearwater Revival around 72, 73, and then he kind of disappeared for 12, 15 years. And then I'm driving down the highway. I think I was at University of Texas at the time, and the disc jockey came on the radio and he said, "I got a new song here by John Fogerty. He used to be the lead singer for Creedence Clearwater Revival." And they played, I think it was Center Field.
Center field, yeah,
Center Field, if you remember that.
absolutely.
It was, and the disc jockey said, he kind of didn't say holy shit, but he said something like that, and he actually stopped the show and he said, "Play that again." I mean, I never heard a disc jockey say, "Stop that, play it again. That's amazing." And I kind of had the same reaction. I was like, it was just something like this came out of nowhere. And there's a lot of music like that. I could give you, different songs. I'll give you one from recent times. Well, recent if you want to say, 8, 9 years ago. But the JC song with Alicia Keys, Empire State of Mind. Now that was written,
Okay.
I think in 2011. It was the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 thing, and it was kind of a tribute to New York and the strength of the people and all the people that survived the 9/11 thing. And it was Empire State of Mind, which is again the rap of Jay-Z, and then you had Alicia Keys coming in on the piano and this huge female, beautiful soprano voice just overpowering. And it was just a wonderful blend of two very different styles of music. Powerful statement, beautifully written. And I remember hearing that, I said, again, holy shit, that's remarkable. Now, I think that one really stands up over time. The other three, maybe not so much, but I'm not really necessarily proud of those choices. But again, those were my 3 or 4 moments where I had to pull the car over. Matt, what were yours?
Well, wait, before I answer, I mean,
Yeah.
you have every right to be proud of those choices. Like, first, no, I'm being serious. Like, you don't have to make, first of all, I think those are all fine choices.
Yeah, they're not bad songs. They're not bad songs.
I can absolutely relate to the first time I heard Der Kommissar
Right.
and be like, wow, that is really unique. And I loved Center Field growing up. And I get why We'll Be Together got your attention, because it grabbed my attention too when I heard it. So I guess what I'm saying is nobody should feel like they have to apologize for their taste in music, even country music. I don't care. Like, I had to give a little jab to country music there. Okay. But
Okay.
Nobody should have to apologize for their taste in music. I
Well
think
said.
those are fine choices. The funny thing that you mentioned about Be My Baby, I just want to go back to a little story. If you remember the Eddie Money song, Take Me Home Tonight, and he actually invites the lead singer of the Ronettes, Ronnie Spector, right?
Yeah, Ronnie Spector, yeah.
To sing that part as like the hook, as the chorus. And it's not like he was the first person to do that, but that's really the trend of music nowadays. You just mentioned Jay-Z and Alicia Keys, is finding a really attractive female voice and combining that with something of a rougher sound. That's kind of the formula these days.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that it's always been that way, but standalone female voices have a tough time being heard. Adele, Beyonce, those are like the exceptions from the past 10 years, right? I guess Taylor Swift and Ariana Grande, but much more often women find themselves having to be the vocalist for music that someone else produced. And there's whole other things we could get into that, but for now, that seems to be a winning formula. So I was just going to put that out there.
Oh, good. Yeah.
What were my songs? Well, I'll tell you a story. I was walking back to my apartment. I lived in Las Vegas in 2000, and somebody was just blasting out of their apartment "Stan" by Eminem. And I did not make it to my apartment. I stood there and I listened to the whole thing. And I still didn't know what that was. Like, I knew Eminem, but I had no idea who Dido was. And she was the beautiful female voice that I just talked about, mixed with the harsher Eminem tone. And it was an amazing song. If you ever listen to the whole thing, it's basically about an obsessed fan of Eminem. It's not a true story, but it could be based on one. An obsessed fan of Eminem's who goes on to commit a murder-suicide, and Eminem realizes too late that this guy was trying to reach out to him as a fan, and Eminem had never gotten back to him, and now the guy's dead. That is by far the bare bones version of it. It is actually one of the best rap songs ever done. And having Dido's voice over it, which I might have made you listen to that
Yes.
before we got on.
Yeah, and I remember
Yeah.
the song, and by the way, I listened to, there's I think a 7-minute version, which is the long one,
Mhm.
and by the way, complete acknowledgement when I say I dislike modern music. That's a very generic statement. Obviously, doesn't mean you don't like anything. And by the way, that song's not necessarily new either. It's when we
Oh,
talk about
that's 20 years old.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, is it really that old? I didn't know that. Okay, well,
Oh,
so
yeah.
but it's so 20 years is not. I guess that's modern. I don't know. I mean, if somebody's listening to us is 22, they're going to think that's classic. Whatever. I mean, but
Quick
so
story.
it's
Yeah.
yeah.
No, quick story. When I was growing up, I went to visit my grandfather, the one who I told you listened to music from the 30s and 40s, and he was showing me his record collection of all these old songs. And this is like 1985 or so. And I asked him, "Do you listen to any new music?" "Oh, yeah. I listen to new music." And he pulls out a Barbara Streisand album from 1970. Like, that was new music to him. That's a true story. So, yeah, that was Eminem, and that was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Just to give you an idea, that was the year 2000.
What were the other moments, by the way, Matt, that where you
Sure.
had to stop in your tracks? I don't want you to lose that. I know we're
Not at
all over the
all.
map here, but I'm having such a good time listening. I don't want you to lose that thought either. So I'm
Not
just
at all. That's
I'm putting
yeah.
this in your file cabinet. Go ahead.
You got it. That's where I was going anyway.
Okay.
All right. So now I'm gonna force you to listen to me talk about electronic dance music a little bit. I'm sorry. You're gonna have to deal with it.
Let me go get a beer.
Okay. Please do. To me, so you've got these different songs that are like iconic for their generation, right? I'm sure you know the ones from the 70s, Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, and those songs that like marked that era of music. And when you ask people about like 1990, most people are going to say Nirvana, right? Because Nirvana burst onto the scene in 1990, and suddenly grunge became a thing, and there became a lot of acts that tried to copy them. Here's what I would say about that. I have all the respect for Nirvana. They created something, like I said, that was original, and you get all sorts of bonus points for originality. Having said that, if you listen to Nirvana even 15 years prior, you would have said, "What the hell are we listening to?" Right? I mean, you would have turned it off. And the grunge movement did not last. It almost felt like it was forced upon us by the music industry, who realized that the era of quote unquote 80s music was coming to an end. And they were like, we need to look for the next big thing. And so they landed on Nirvana. And you had grunge music, which did not even last the entire decade, to be honest. But by the end of the 90s, it was done, by and large. But there was another song that came out in 1990 that was noticed, but not nearly as much. And that was Sadness by Enigma. And that song, 30 years later, I think people can look back maybe now and recognize that that was the song that shaped music for years to come. And I'll explain why.
Excuse me, Matt.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to make sure, unless you're going to get it,
Sure.
because because of copyright laws, we can't play the song. But for those again like me that may be like, what was that? What song is that? It has a lot. It has Gregorian chants in it, right? It's that song that has
Yes.
a very popular song, but it actually sounds kind of like you're in church. That would be the best way to describe it. Would you agree?
Yeah, well, that's definitely one of its identifying features. Yes,
Yeah.
and it's spelled Sadness, Sadness. A lot of people think it's sadness, but it was really about the Marquis de Sade. So the song is Sadness.
Wow.
It had, what did it have? It had a beautiful woman's voice. It had a man's rougher voice. It had an electronic beat. And it had Gregorian chants, like you said, in the background. Who would have ever thought to put that into pop music? And Enigma was a project, but it is really one man behind it. His name is Michael Cretu. And he was a classically trained musician from Germany. And I'm fascinated by the arc of his career. So I just want to say real quick, like he started making music in like the late 70s, and he was trying to make pop music, and he collaborated with German pop singers, and he made some hits, but to him that didn't really feel like his calling. So he wanted to create a new genre of music, and he did. He created basically a combination of disco, new age, electronic, synthesized pop, but with a feeling of like just floating, like you're it's what came to be known as trance music, you know, that you're just being taken somewhere else by this music. And when it came out, he said this is either going to be an enormous hit or an enormous flop, because either people are going to, you know, it's going to appeal to them or it won't.
Yeah.
And it was an enormous hit. And that formula was immediately copied for the next 2 or 3 years. Suddenly, you had all these artists trying to copy exactly what he did. And, you know, he describes it later on. Again, listening to interviews with him is another fascinating pursuit. But, you know, he's like, at the time, I was really pissed off. But looking back on it, it was a compliment. It's like all these people thought I had the music that should be copied. And so what did he do? He switched his sound. Now he went from Gregorian chants to African chants for his next album. And he still used some of the same formula that worked, with like a beautiful woman's voice and a rougher man's voice and a beat, and an electronic beat with a synthesized sound to it, but at the same time, a trance feeling that made you feel like you were floating, you were removed, and just imagining different places, and, you know, not too different from Pink Floyd in that aspect, right? And he cites Pink Floyd as one of his inspirations. That music was fascinating. And I will argue to my death that that's been the most influential song of the past 30 years. And now, today, the legacy carries on. We're not going to hear it so much on radio stations, even if we did listen to modern radio, which I don't think we do that much. But they're not going to play Enigma the way they did back in 1990. But when you go to clubs, when you go to raves, when you do the things that the younger generation is doing right now, concerts, you know, EDM concerts like you described, you know, which are bigger than any pop concert, right? I mean, this festival you're talking about in Las Vegas lasts for a week, and people come from all over the world to attend. And
yeah, it's a lifestyle event, not just a music event. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It is. And it can mostly be traced back to Enigma and the like-minded music of that time. So when I heard Sadness, yeah, I just stopped in my tracks. I was like, this is like nothing I've ever heard before. I went out, I immediately got the album. Now, information wasn't as widely available back then, right? So there was an air of mystery to it, because he didn't use his real name. And nobody's real name was used on the album. They used
You didn't have the internet. You couldn't look up who this was or know anything about him, would you? Yeah.
No, you didn't. And it was like whispers. It was like, who is this really? You know, because they didn't do concerts. They didn't do anything like that. So, you know, when all was said and done, they sold 70 million albums, right? And they're still going. I mean, their most recent album was 2016, but they've evolved. And electronic music has evolved. And it might not be as obvious to you or to people who don't, who it doesn't appeal to, but there's been a definite progression in the music that you can listen to something and say, oh, that was from the 90s, and listen to another one and say, oh, that was from the 2000s, and listen to something more recent and say, oh, this is definitely from 2010.
Excuse me, Matt. Excuse me. Can you identify the sound of, let's say, I call it EDM music, electronic dance music, and you can tell roughly what decade it was released in?
Yes, and without, I'm running into the same dilemma as you. Without actually playing some, it's hard to really get into but it's more about, you know, are we listening to, 128 beats per minute or 140 beats per minute? Are we, is it sounding, upbeat, or is it sounding a little more grimy? Or, is this music that was meant to be played at a club in the 1990s in the US, or is it meant to be played at a rave, in 2010 in Ibiza?
Wow.
Just that sort of distinction. And again, we're going back to what I said at the beginning, there's no limit to it. Michael Cretu, people came to call him the alchemist, and he loved that nickname because to him, it's like an alchemist has the same ingredients as everybody else. They just do a better job of mixing them and coming up with something new. And that's what you have with electronic music. You have all the ingredients at your disposal. And it's just a question of who is combining them the best. And that's, to me, the future of music. Whether it's the future of what you'll see on the charts or radio airplay or things like that, probably not. But in terms of what we'll look back on from, a society standpoint, what are we going to remember 30 years from now? Are we going to remember the acts that top the charts, the ones you just read? Are we going to remember them, or are we going to remember the progression of electronic music? I think we're going to remember electronic music. That's my crystal ball, right or wrong.
Oh, excellent. Wow. Well, let's go deeper into the musicians themselves, the composers, the writers of songs, and in many cases today, um, that means having a computer or a laptop and software. It doesn't necessarily mean, as you mentioned, having a guitar or a piano or the instruments that you know we grew up with, say 2 or 3 generations ago. I spent a lot of time in New Orleans. Family there, and I've spent a lot of time there also. And I remember one thing that just struck me, and that's that if you see the students there, and I'm talking about in public schools, not just private schools, but you will see all children carrying instruments.
Mhm.
Of course, that's a music city. It's just part. It's in the DNA of that city. It's a
Right.
very unique place. I think New York has a little bit of that. Obviously, you grew up in the Bronx, I know,
Mhm.
and of course, where I grew up, maybe even less, certainly less so. But I mean, a lot of urban areas certainly have these influences, but nothing like New Orleans, where kids 6 and 7 years old carrying a trumpet. I mean,
Right.
it's remarkable to be at a school and see all these kids carrying instruments. And by the way, this is 2020 I'm talking about. This is today. I'm not
Mhm.
talking about in Louis Armstrong's day. So the reason that's why again you have so many incredible musicians. Now a lot of it's jazz, and a lot of it's blues, and more of a southern sound, and this and that. But you have remarkable musicianship. Say there's New Orleans is not the biggest city in the country. It's I think 40th in population or something. But if you were to add up all the musicians that have come out of that city, it's
Mhm.
a staggering. It's probably per capita the most creative musical city probably in the country. Again per capita speaking. So again, I think that dates back to these children growing up with music in their lives all the time, hearing it out their windows at night, having to play instruments in the schools, and it just becomes part of who you are. Now, obviously, I think we're music people, so we're going to say, should music be taught? That's an obvious yes. But I do wonder about what I call the transition of exposure to music. That it's not through guitars and drums and horn instruments and pianos. It's now through a computer. Are we losing something? Does it take just as much talent to create and write music, say through a software program on your laptop, as it does sitting at a piano like Elton John had to do, like Carole King had to do? I mean, is there an equivalency here on creativity and talent when it comes to software programs versus, say, the old style instruments? What do you think?
I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I
Okay.
mean, if you, um, this is a generalization, but it's a solid generalization that the best artists at electronic music are the ones that had some training on instruments, that grew up around music, that played the piano, played the guitar, learned their scales, learned the old fashioned way. The people that learned, quote unquote, the old fashioned way do a much better job of making fantastic electronic music. So I don't think it's an either or, right? I think there's still an argument to be made that you get the classical style training before you try to jump in head first and just use your computer to make music. And the reason for that is, like, again, going back to sampling, right? Eminem sampled Dido in that example. Rap artists are sampling constantly. It used to be mostly a rap thing. Now it's all music. I mean, people have always sampled to some extent, but now it's like much more part of the culture, where it's like almost expected that you're going to sample from somebody else's music. And that's fine. So there are people that are excellent at finding the right samples to do at the right time, but you still have to inject your own degree of originality into whatever it is you're creating. Like, you can't just mishmash a bunch of old stuff and then call it your own. Like, you need to be able to create on your own. So that's where this, classical training comes in. It just opens so many more doors for you, where it's like, okay, if I wanted to, I could create music just on my own. Like, I could write my own song, I could make my own album. But now I'm going to combine the music. Rather than having to make an hour's worth of music on my own, I'm going to make 15 minutes worth of great music on my own. And then I'm going to bring in 45 minutes, just as an example, of electronic music or samples of beats of whatever that's going to work together with the music I created to make a sound that's going to appeal to people. So I think that's where we're headed. I think maybe I didn't explain that properly before, where it's like, electronic music doesn't mean all you did is sit down in front of a computer and hit a few keys.
I didn't really think about that. So and certainly the all the tools of technology that are now available, as you say, are not exclusive. They enhance the creativity of an artist. And I remember Stevie Wonder, for example.
Right.
I think the Songs in the Key of Life came out in 1977. One of my favorite albums, one of the greatest albums of all
Great
time.
album. Great
and
album.
And he talked about he had heard there was this, I forgot the song. Is it oh gosh, now Sir Duke or something? Maybe it is Sir Duke. I forgot what song it is. But anyway, it has this electronic piano, but the keys are real bouncy, and it's kind of a really strange sound. Again, for 1977. It was such a strange sound at the time. And Stevie Wonder, I forgot he was influenced. I think it was David Bowie. He's heard David Bowie do something strange with a keyboard, and he asked how they got the sound. He shows up at the recording studio. This was in like Behind the Music or one of those things. But it talked about, again, how artists borrow from each other and are sparked by ideas, and then all of a sudden Stevie Wonder's coming up with this brand new sound, which I'm sure was copied by everybody when they first heard it.
And to take that a step further, one of the interesting things about music, and why hopefully music will continue, new music will continue to be made forever. I mean, we could argue that we're in a very isolated time in our lives, right? We spend a lot of time at home, on social media, etc. But I would argue that musicians are collaborating now more than they ever did.
Yeah.
I mean, the internet makes that possible. More than that, artists realize that they need each other, in the current music environment where it's really hard to make a living. I mean, that's an understatement, right? Even for the best artists. It used to be, if one of your songs made it onto the radio, you were going to be in pretty good shape. And now one of your songs makes it onto the radio, and that's nothing. Like, it's like, okay, what's next? You can't just be a one-hit wonder. So artists realize that they need to collaborate a lot more. You look at an album now, I'm not going to, whoever, I mean, any popular artist now, I would tell, if there's 12 songs on it, at least 8 of them are going to say featuring so-and-so, right? It's very rare for an artist to just be going it alone these days. Like, they bring in names, and they do it for each other. I mean, this is a mutual thing. Like, I'll sing on your album, you sing on my album. And then by the time you've done that with 7 or 8 different people, now you've got an album of 12 songs where you've got 8 different guest vocalists. It's like, all right, now you've got a lot more diverse sound on your album. Now it's going to appeal to a lot more people. So that's also become a winning formula. And so, I mean, that's at the top level. But even below the top level, you have people sharing their music on YouTube, and then it's like, wow, or through any, music sharing app, and somebody else will be like, oh, wow, that's similar to what I've been trying to come up with. I'm going to contact this guy and see if we can collaborate. And more often than not, just contacting somebody out of thin air, when it's a fellow musician, leads to some form of collaboration where it's like, oh, this person likes my music, I like his music. We are each creating a sound that is appealing to each other. Let's see what we can do together. And that's music has always brought people together, but I think now even more than ever, in given how isolated we are, music is the one thing that's transcended that.
Yeah, very good. Well, Matt, let me ask you to change hats for a moment, and I'm going to ask you to play at least amateur psychologist, or try to explain this phenomenon. Maybe, by the way, maybe you will not agree with my premise, but I'm going to spell it out.
Okay.
I'll let you take a breather, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a story, and but I'm going to build up to basically my question, if I may. So we talked earlier about all generations. They tend to hate the music of the next generation or the current generation. I can, the examples are obvious here, but the older people, when Elvis first came out, older people hated Elvis Presley. Now he's
Hmm.
tame by comparison. The Elvis generation, say, of the 1950s, and you talked about your family loving doo-wop. Well, they hated the Beatles and the Stones, this new sound, the British invasion, a whole different thing. And then there was disco, and the rockers hated disco when disco took over in the late 70s. And then the punk rockers kind of came in, about the same time, maybe in the 80s, and we're like, what in the hell is that? And then new wave comes in, and again, if you're a traditional rocker, you don't like new wave, and new wave. There's this interesting thing; these dominoes keep falling, and the one after it, and then there's grunge, as we talked about, and then there's electronic dance music, and so forth and so on. And social scientists that have commented on this or written about this talk about really how healthy this is. And
Hmm.
what they speak of is the next generation or the current generation. It has an obligation, and it is a natural. It's a natural condition of growing up to violate norms and push boundaries. And there's an author named David Elkind who wrote a book. It was titled All Grown Up and No Place to Go. He's a professor of child development at Tufts University. And in one chapter, he noted that the teenager's brain is always under construction, or that's the time where it starts getting really packed with information, and that's really where it's very impressionable, and that's where you get a lot of the reasons that you are who you are today. A lot of that is because of what happened, say, between the ages of roughly 14 and say 19, and during the teenage years, the areas of the brain are developing, and then again, this is the time when you're open to music and new ideas and new sounds. And there's also, again, this rebellion that your parents seem old fashioned, their music seems old fashioned, the way they dress seems boring. I mean, this is a common thing for every single generation. And so what is the natural thing to do? Well, it's to rebel. It's to let your hair grow long or short in some cases. Now it goes the other way sometimes, and dress wild, or the shirts get shorter, or they get longer, or the clothes go black, or there's an androgyny now, certainly between sexes, and certainly in music, that's part of the scene, and things that again, I'm not obviously making any kind of judgment about this, but these are things that are upsetting to people, particularly older people or the previous generation. So I'm leading into really something that I'd like to ask about, what I call, when does that creative energy and process and genius end? And I don't know if I'm right on this. I think I'm kind of right just by the examples, but I want you to tell me I'm not right and give me the counter argument to what I'm about to say. And that's that if you look at the great acts of, certainly, let's say, popular music, and those are the obvious names that will come up. Let's go all the way back to Frank Sinatra. Now, Sinatra was popular his entire life, but he burst on the scene when he was in his 20s. Same
Hmm.
is true for Elvis Presley. Chuck Berry, in his 20s. The Beatles, they were all in their 20s. The Stones in their 20s. Sam Cooke, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, David Bowie. I could go on and on, that when they wrote the music that we now call classics, they were 23, 24, 25, 26 years old. Did you know when the Beatles broke up in 1970, which was 50 years ago, every one of the Beatles was 28 or 29 years old. They were not even
Right,
on their
right,
30th birthday. And imagine that catalog of music that they'd written, and they're not even 30 years old yet. And
right.
then, and I'll use the Beatles because that's just such an easy example that people can latch onto because everyone pretty much knows the group and they know the music. But what happens after the Beatles? Well, they go their own way, and and they wrote, obviously McCartney and Lennon especially wrote, and Harrison even wrote a number of songs that are quite good. But I don't think anybody would compare them to, say, the catalog of music that they wrote as a group. Now, I think some of that's not just the fact that they were a greater force together, but I think a lot of it's age too. And you just notice that as these musicians age and composers age, for the most part, unless they're doing movie soundtracks, Hans Zimmer and uh, Ennio Morricone and people like that. I mean, that do movie music, or John Williams. I mean, they can compose music into their 80s. But there's something about pop music specifically that kind of like after 30 you're dead, or 35 or 40 somewhere. You seem to Paul McCartney is not writing Hey Jude and Let It Be and Yesterday. He's not writing that when he's 38 years old or 48 or 58. He wrote all those songs when he was 25 or
Right.
26. So I'm wondering what happens to the creative process. Can a musician still be as put out just as much great stuff, say after the age of whatever 30 something, or is this just something that happens to the DNA? Maybe you're not as hungry. Explain that, and maybe you don't even agree with my premise. What do you think?
Oh no, I definitely agree with your premise. I mean, I think it's hard to dispute that, right? I mean, I don't think that's just with music alone. I mean, in the most basic sense, it's like when people have less entanglements in their life, then they can focus more on being creative. I mean, if if you're married or you have a child, I mean, you could look to your spouse, you could look to your child for inspiration, but also at the same time, they're taking a large piece of your energy. Not on purpose. It's not like they're siphoning it from you, but they're you need to focus more of your energy, not just on yourself and not just on your creativity. So, I think that crosses all genres, not just music, where it's like you're going to do your best work when you were younger. I wrote a poker book, when I was in my late 20s. I couldn't possibly do it now. I mean, even if I had the same, knowledge base and whatnot, like just the energy to do it was then. It's not there now. Um, and maybe it's a combination of that. And then, like you said, teenagers are trying to rebel. You're trying to come up with something that sounds new, right? And then you reach a point as you get older, and you've had to work hard to create all this new music for a decade in the Beatles case, and you develop a greater appreciation for what else is out there. And you're like, wow, this has been such an effort. Let me pay homage to the people that came before me, and wow, they created some great music too. And just you start to maybe lose some of your edge. It's like when you're a teenager or when you're in your early 20s, you think everything that you have to say is unique, and you're the first one that ever thought of it, right? And then the more that you learn, the more that you start to feel like, oh, you know what, maybe I am just one piece in the greater picture, and that sort of stops your creative process a little bit, where it's like, can I really maintain the level of creativity I did before? It's like, even if I come up with good standalone music, it's not going to be as good as what I did before. And it's always going to be compared to what I did before.
Yeah.
And therefore, do I want to go through that effort? Do I want to go through that? I mean, there's a lot of groups that make music way past their prime. Paul McCartney is still making music. I mean, he's never stopped. But how many songs of his can you name from the past 25 years?
Well, probably very few. I mean, when's the last time he charted? Yeah, that's
Right.
exactly right. I mean,
Right.
how do you write so much incredible music? By the way, I don't mean one
Yeah.
song a year. He's writing 7 or 8 remarkable songs a year, and that's like every month he's coming up with Yesterday or Michelle or
Right.
Eleanor Rigby. I mean, how in the hell do you do that?
Right.
Yeah, and by the way, it's not like he's sitting at home. They're touring, and they're they were like kind of busy, always being interviewed, and
Right.
it's not like you have any free time here. So to come up with this kind of catalog of music in such a short period of time is just it's just stunning.
Oh, it is. I mean, and the Beatles, I mean, obviously they're the outlier, right? I mean, there's a
Well,
reason
you could apply,
why.
but you could apply that to, I'm applying this to, Lady Gaga today. Amy Winehouse, when she was popular before she died 8 or 9 years ago. Now, does she had a retro sound, by the way? It was I think that's one of
Yeah.
her appeals. But I mean, if you take a lot of these people, they again, they just, they're just, it's just who they are. They just can somehow get in front of a microphone or in front of a piano, and they can just write and compose good stuff. I like to see Lady Gaga when she's 55. I mean that in a creative sense is what I meant. I wonder. I love Lady Gaga. I'm a huge fan of hers. But
Well,
I wonder. I wonder if she's not going to be able to do that same act, that she does now. Well, maybe she can, but I don't think she'll be doing the same act. And so what I wonder is that, obviously you've got to change with the times, and every musician has had to do that. You can't do the same thing over and over, except here in Las Vegas, where there's, it's kind of a nostalgia thing for, the Wayne Newton thing. He's always done the same thing and made a fortune doing that. But I don't think that's really, no one's going to put Wayne Newton. That's a whole different, that's performance art. That's not music. So, which will piss people off when I say that. But I do wonder though about, musicians having to change, and some just maybe aren't able to. Maybe that's the problem. You again, Chuck Berry is a good example. I'm just using examples that people understand. Chuck Berry was a complete icon, complete, the king of rock and roll, and some people say. But what did he do after 1958? Anything? I mean, he kind of toured and played the same old Johnny B. Good every single concert. I'm not knocking him, by the way, but he didn't really do much after 58. He just, he pretty much did. He was a nostalgia act his last 30 years of his life.
Well, I
And
mean,
so what I wonder is, was he just not able to, change with the times? Maybe that's part of it.
Right. I'd say it's a combination, right? I mean, I don't think you necessarily have to pinpoint a single thing. It's probably difficult to change with the times, and he knew whatever he created would always be thought of as, oh, well, that's good, but it's not as good as Johnny B. Good. So, at some point you reach a point, like I have this belief that every prominent artist, musician, what have you, had their masterpiece at one point, like their personal masterpiece. And it doesn't mean that they can't make good music after that. I just feel like you can look at any act and be like, wow, that was their peak right there. That was their masterpiece. And now the great ones like the Beatles, you can't just narrow it down to one song. You got to go with several and say that their peak lasted a long time. But you also had four separate creative minds working together there, which is a really unique. I mean, each of them were really good standalone music, great standalone musicians. Even Ringo Starr, even George Harrison. I mean, their solo careers don't stand up to their Beatles careers, but they had solid solo careers as well. I mean, so you had four legitimate musicians working together, to make a super group. That'll probably never happen again to that degree. I'll give you a modern example. Taylor Swift, who gets shit on all the time, right? Who might not be your cup of tea, might not be my cup of tea. She deserves all the credit in the world because she has been churning out music that she writes herself for, I don't know, going on 20 years now, I would say. It's pretty close. Is a lot of her music similar? Yeah. She's always talking about relationships, always talking about, the men in her life, etc., and being a woman, and then you can narrow down the focus of her music. Having said that, she's still putting out new relevant music over a period of time that rivals anybody, that is finding a niche. Like, it's popular, it gets radio airplay, she is still a household name as much as she was when she first came on the scene. So to have that longevity in this point in music history, where again, it's that much harder to come up with anything original, deserves all the credit in the world, even if that music is not your cup of tea. I have to say one other thing, and I know I'm going to alienate some of your listeners from here. I'm going to take I'm going to take the don'ts on Lady Gaga. I'm sorry. I think she is, as a performer, She is the most talented performer. Bar none, she is a fantastic stage performer. If we're going to talk about her creative ability, she has lifted, and when I say lifted, I mean outright stolen way too much music to be appreciated the way that you sound like you're appreciating her for that aspect of her music making. Like, you know, it's one thing to sample other people. She has lifted entire songs and made them her own, and then basically gotten behind a wall of lawyers when the other artists come at her with lawsuits for copyright infringement. So I don't have respect for that part. Again, I think if she had just like marketed herself as this fantastic performer, which she is, that's all she needed, you know. But to me, she crossed a line that pisses off fellow musicians that you shouldn't really cross. That's all. I have no problem with her as a person. Otherwise, she seems to be involved with some great charities and so, you know, things like that. But then she should have also given people the writing credits that they deserved. That's all.
Well, I won't argue that only because it's so late in the show. I would don't get mad at me because I'd love to follow up and learn more about that. Maybe that's the subject of a follow-up thing we'll do eventually. And by the way, if you're listening and you're a fan, be sure and direct all your threats and angry mail to Matt Lessinger.
No, don't give out my info. Forget it.
I can't give out your address. This has been a great conversation. We're about an hour and a half in, and it's really, I've learned a remarkable number of things here, and I've actually changed my mind on some things. I'm proud of that. You've really been very persuasive and moving me in the direction of appreciating a lot of modern music that I don't think I appreciated nearly as much 90 minutes ago. And you've also told me about, certainly electronic dance music and, music made by software programs and so forth, that's something that requires a lot of talent, and that's really, whether we like it or not, that's going to be the future, and that's the way a lot of music is going to be created in the future. Before we go, Matt, I will leave it open to you. If you have any other questions or comments, I don't want to cut you off because I could just go on. I know the listeners, if you've been with us so far, you probably could listen another hour or so, but we got a few more minutes. Any other thoughts?
Sure. I mean, since the idea by and large was to talk about today's music, I'll give you an example from the past decade, from 2010 to 2019. For me, the best pop song that came from that decade was Starboy, which is The Weeknd, who you mentioned is in the top 10 right now. The Weeknd is actually one man. It's not a group. The Weeknd featuring Daft Punk, who you may remember from the recesses of your mind. Daft Punk is a French electronic dance music duo that actually won Album of the Year.
They wear those robot costumes, right?
Yes, yeah. They wear the robot costumes. They won Album of the Year when I would not have put your money on. I would not have put $1 on them to win. It was a downright shock. But I get why they won. It's not a shock because they make bad music. It's a shock that Grammy voters were willing to get behind them. So who is The Weeknd? The Weeknd is this African-American singer with an absolutely beautiful voice. He has a lovely voice. And what's unique is that his lyrics are very crude and sometimes depressing because he's battled with depression and he's open about that. And he uses very crude and vulgar lyrics to set the scene that run completely counter to his melodious voice. And then you back that up with like top-notch electronic music by Daft Punk in the background. And that was a phenomenal collaboration. And to me, that was the best pop song of the decade. And that, again, is where largely where a lot of pop music is going, where you've got a beautiful voice. More often than not, it's a woman. So that's why this was kind of unique in that it was a man's voice. But more often than not, a female vocal layered over a solid electronic track with possibly, some harsher male vocals thrown in. Maybe the woman does the singing for the first two verses, and then what we would commonly call the bridge, becomes like a rap, and then you go back to the female vocal to wrap up the song. And in the whole time this is going on, the beat and the pulsating of the electronic music gets, harder and stronger until it climaxes at the end of the song. Again, this is a winning formula. I could fully understand why EDM would not be your cup of tea or a lot of people's cup of tea in our generation. We're not going to clubs. We're not going to raves. We're not going to, the cultural party that you described. Although I would argue that if you ever decided to go, despite your age, you would absolutely be accepted there. You'd be welcome there. Nobody would make fun of you, for being older and wanting to be part of that scene. Because it's a very open-minded, welcoming all people kind of scene. And they pride themselves on that. And, if they play hours of electronic music, you're certainly not going to like all of it, but probably something will resonate with you out of, everything that you listen to. And, that's the difference between growing up with radio. It's like you had to listen to radio and you had to listen to a lot of songs that maybe you didn't like to get to the song that you did. Well, now you have Pandora and other similar programs. They're going to know what you like. It's like, oh, he likes this song, let's play this song for him. And they're just going to give you an endless loop of songs that more than 50% of the time you're going to like. And so given that that's the case, there's really no incentive to branch out and listen to new genres of music, because the first time you hear an electronic dance music on Pandora and you skip over it after 2 seconds, they're not going to try you again. They're going to stick with what they know you like. Oh, he liked Pink Floyd? All right, let's play Led Zeppelin. Let's play Creedence Clearwater Revival. Let's play other 70s music. Oh, he keeps liking that. Oh, he skipped over this. He skipped over this 80s song. All right, we won't play any 80s for him anymore. So it's a blessing and a curse. Like they're allowing you to waste less time with music you don't like, but they're not exposing you to things that you may like if you gave them enough of a chance. That's where we're at in music today. Those younger people are more willing to sift through the music they might not like to get to something that they do. And we're at the age where we don't have the patience for that anymore, by and large. And that's, I think, one of the main differences why the younger generation is going to have more of a say in music, because they're willing to experiment more and listen to more different types. No, I don't like that. This is different. Oh, this is what I like. Okay, now let me use all the electronic tools at my disposal to discover these bands that will never make it onto the radio. And you would have never heard them if it wasn't for the internet or for YouTube or for whatever. But now in this day and age, you can find such a wide variety of music that to limit yourself is in my mind, it's really a crime. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, that's really good advice. The last sentence there, certainly, if you limit yourself, and it's anything, but especially to music, given all that's out there. And even if music you don't like, explore, open a new door, and you may be surprised what you find in the room. Real quick sidebar story on that. I never been a country music fan, but if you watch Ken Burns' documentary series on PBS that was on a few months ago, it was the history of country music, I think, done in 8 or 9 parts, maybe 10 parts, and it was a couple hours each night on country music. Man, I came away with that, first of all, with a great appreciation and knowledge for the history of not just country music, but America and music, but then came away with also just a really a deep appreciation for those artists, and many of them very brave, by the way. So I think that, again, I thought I knew that. I thought I had my opinion made up. No, I didn't. I'm 58 and I changed my opinion about something, just as I changed my opinion on this show by being convinced by a lot of your persuasive arguments about the value and artistry and creativity and genius of a lot of modern music. Matt Lessinger, thank you for joining me and being my guest. We somehow were able to do this in, well, a little over an hour and a half. And I never thought, I'll quote Van Morrison. I think he came up with this quote. He said, writing or talking about music, music is like dancing to architecture. It doesn't, like, if you do music, you play music, you listen to music, you don't talk about it. That's why he had critics and all that. But we were able to talk for nearly 2 hours about music, and we could easily talk more about it, and we will next time. But really a lot of fun, Matt. Thank you for joining me. I learned a lot. I know the listeners did too. We'll do something else next week. So without further ado, this is Nolan Dalla with Matt Lessinger. Really a terrific discussion, and we'll see you next time on An Intelligent Conversation.